it is my pleasure to welcome a big radical disruptor who does so much good in California and beyond, Dr. Robert Ross of the California Endowment.
Thank you all for being here. I mean, it's a pretty amazing idea. I don't consider myself a radical disruptor. We are investors in radical disruptors. And so what I thought I'd do is just to tell 3 or 4 stories of radical disruptors we invest in who are changing the world in just powerful ways. Some of them have been maybe occasionally featured in the news, one of them at least on CNN. But they're not names that you see in the headlines because they're just quietly plugging away, doing powerful, radical, compassionate, loving, caring work. And I just want to tell you about them. As a CEO of the California Endowment, you know, as Giselle mentioned, we're a health foundation. We invest in ideas and people with ideas, and hopefully ideas that have power and transformation. It is the greatest gift on this planet. It's this job that I have, to be able to meet with and talk to and get inspired by these kinds of individuals. And it's the antidote to what happens when you're watching CNN and the news. Let me start with our first disruptor. Our first disruptor is this woman, Malika Sarr. In recent years, we've seen extraordinary increases in sexual trafficking and the rate of sexual trafficking, particularly among young women and young girls, not just internationally, but in the United States. Okay. And the reason for this is pure market economics. Drug gangs, who previously only had one product line, which was selling drugs, discovered that trafficking young women was pretty lucrative business, and also a good way to earn money, and it was less risky from the standpoint of criminal prosecution, because it's a much harder crime to prosecute. Okay? So we've seen astronomical increases in sexual trafficking in girls in this country. It was going off the charts. And the problem, in addition to that, but the problem is even when the girls come into custody, typically law enforcement was criminalizing these girls, or offering the threat of criminalization as a way to get them to give up who the trafficker was, right? So this kind of space in between the law enforcement community and these girls. And so a group of fired up women about this, including Malika, and a young group of women who, and this will be a theme for the night, where the people who are actually victimized by the oppression and injustice actually become the heroes in their own lives, right? But with some young women who were ex-trafficked young girls themselves, decided to go on a campaign, and the name of the campaign was "There's No Such Thing." Okay? And "There's No Such Thing" means both from the standpoint, it's a message to law enforcement, but it's also a message to the media, because the media was describing these women in stories as child prostitutes. And if you just think about that terminology just for a second, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Okay? These girls are victims. They have been raped. They have been abused. And so prostitute does not describe accurately and fairly who they are, right? With an organization called Rights for Girls, which if you're so inclined, you can support Rights for Girls International campaign on this work. But this was a press conference we had in Los Angeles about a year ago. And that's Sheriff Jim McDonald, that's County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, and we had a bunch of law enforcement officials and elected officials rallying around this theme of "there's no such thing," and began to change the policies and practices of the district attorney's office, the sheriff's office, and law enforcement, so that these young girls would not be criminalized and they would get the kind of support that they need. In addition to that, they petitioned newspapers such as the New York Times and the LA Times and the Associated Press to stop using that language in their stories. Stop calling these young women child prostitutes. That's not who they are. That's not what they are. There is no such thing. And so what you see Malika there, who is the leader, she's actually now at Google. And the woman standing to her immediate left is a formerly trafficked young woman who's one of the spokespersons on this issue. Radical disruption, radical idea, tremendous inspiration. Second radical disruptor is actually a group, not an individual, called the Dreamers. Some of you are familiar with the Dreamers. How many have you heard of the Dreamers? You know who they are. That's wonderful. Okay. So it's interesting because we've seen people come out of the closet of illegal immigration. We call them in California undocumented. But prior to the Dreamers, if you interviewed someone on camera who was undocumented, usually you kind of shaded their face and hid their face, or maybe there was a kerchief, right? Because it was dangerous and scary for them to be seen in public admitting that they were undocumented and admitting that they didn't have legal citizenship status in this country. And it was the Dreamers, a young group of undocumented, many of them college students, community college students, some of them just activists and organizers in communities, who threw that idea away, disrupted that idea and said, you know what, I may not have been born in California, but California was born in me. My family's contributing to this community. This is our home. This is where we love this country. And they became the Dreamers. Okay? And so the Dreamers led a campaign that we helped support called Health for All, which prior to the campaign, if you were an undocumented child in the state of California, you could not get health insurance coverage. The only way you get health coverage is if you ended up with some kind of bad emergency in an emergency room, then maybe the state Medicaid program might pay for that emergency service, but they could not get health insurance coverage. And the Dreamers led this statewide campaign, going and marching on Sacramento, talking about the benefits of their community, of their families, what they give to this country. A lot of people, just as an example, you'll see this undocumented California facts. A lot of Americans don't realize that undocumented persons pay taxes, and they pay a lot of taxes. And in California, those taxes are in the $3 billion range. Okay, they pay a range of taxes. So they pay into this community, they're not free riders, and they contribute. And the Dreamers came out of the closet publicly with their voice. A bill was introduced in the state legislature. The bill, for the first time in the nation, allowed for health insurance coverage for children who are undocumented in the state of California through the Medicaid program. Okay? So an amazing, amazing victory at a time when you understand in our nation, undocumented and illegal immigration is still a very hot political controversy. The third disruptor is Scott Budnick. Scott Budnick is basically a guy who was a Hollywood producer. And he produced the Hangover movies, of all things. Right? Very successful. I guess there was a Hangover 1 and a Hangover 2, Hangover 3. I didn't see any of them. But Scott became inspired and radically transformed when he visited a juvenile justice facility here in Los Angeles County. Fell in love with those young people and those kids who were in prison and were incarcerated. Began to mentor them with his free weekends on Saturdays. That turned into more of a consistent program, a mentoring program inside the juvenile halls and the juvenile facilities, and began to bond with these young people and began to offer them a pathway of hope and opportunity from the time they did their time in juvenile hall and in a juvenile incarcerated facility, promising them work, promising them an opportunity to get a job, encouraging them to get their degree, get their GED, get their community college degree, even go to college in prison if it's possible. With some prisons you can do that. And so Scott became fired up about this idea of helping these young people, started with young men, I'm now working with young women as well, who are incarcerated, and giving them a chance for opportunity, a sense of a vision, a sense of hope. Created an organization called ARC, which is the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. And what they do is not only provide networks of support for young people who are getting ready to make that transition from inside jail and inside juvenile hall and into the community. That's a very rough and difficult transition. The national recidivism rate, the national failure rate is around 65 to 70%. With organizations like Homeboy Industries, like ARC, making 70, 75, 80% of these young people having success once they come out. And on top of that, on top of making sure that they've got opportunities for social supports, emotional supports, mental health services, job training, in addition, they create a network of support for one another, and they also advocate for people behind bars and making sure that they've got a life of opportunity, that they really are being rehabilitated in a meaningful sense, in a compassionate sense. And they've done a great job of lobbying for legislation to change the justice reform system, to change our hyper-incarceration pipeline, to change the prison pipeline in this country that has seen a 400% increase in the prison population since the 1990s. So Scott Budnick, another transformative hero and another radical disruptor. Similarly, DeVone Boggan. DeVone hails from Richmond, California. DeVone had another radical disruptive idea. He did some youth work in Richmond, which has a very significant gang problem. It had a very high homicide rate in the city of Richmond, was going up and up and up for 30, 40 years. And DeVone was working for the city of Richmond in community safety and public safety. And his radical idea was to convince the police chief and the local district attorney to help him outreach to the baddest guys in town. Who are the guys with the longest records, the gang leaders in the community? And his radical idea, DeVone's radical idea, was to bring those gang leaders in, to bring those shot callers in, turn them into a network, ask them and challenge them to be peacemakers and peacekeepers in the community. Could they use their leadership skills? Could they use their power of influence to create peace rather than to shoot up people in the streets? You know? Everyone thought, of course, he was crazy. Of course, the police chief and the mayor said no way, but DeVone persisted, started with just a couple of kids. Those kids did well, grew the group. Now there's a network of young people called Advanced Peace. And in the city of Richmond, we have seen a 70% decrease in shootings and a 50% decrease in homicides because of DeVone's leadership. So once again, the people who are often stigmatized, marginalized, written off, considered the worst of the worst in the community, through compassion, through radical disruption in terms of reaching out to people and bringing them in, believing in them, believing in their light, supporting their dreams and their hopes, tapping into their hopes and their dreams. You see that real, what used to be considered gang members and thugs can be peacekeepers and leaders in their community. Some common themes of these kinds of radical disruptors. One is that they have a very powerful sense of fairness and justice. Okay? That if you see an injustice and you do nothing about it, you are not being neutral. Thirdly, a deep sense, an abiding sense of passion for what they do. And in addition to that, they view failure differently. All of these people have failed, okay, along the way. And they merely view failure as a step in the process. These are the kinds of people that came to mind that inspire me and stir my soul, and I hope in some small way they've done that with you tonight. Thank you.
How about a warm applause of gratitude for Dr. Ross? We live in very interesting times. You've been with the Endowment a very long time. How would you kind of define this climate of increased hate, bigotry, marginalization of the poor, the undocumented? All of the people that you serve most seem to be under attack in ways that they have not been in our recent history. Do you agree with that? And how would you kind of quantify the times that you are presiding over?
Yeah, I mean, the politics of what's happening with these types of people that who are stigmatized and marginalized and oppressed, it's pretty frightening. And I think it's bigger than, this is bigger than Trump or Democrats or Republicans or Fox News or MSNBC. This is a big deal about what's happening to our nation. And in my view, I'm beginning to wonder whether the civic soul of our nation is in some great struggle right now. Right? And there are a number of ways to describe that epic battle, but right now it feels like inclusion versus exclusion. Can we have an American dream that is inclusive with a large and expansive circle of human concern and compassion? And can we see one another as partners towards the American dream? Or do we see one another in some kind of Darwinian, I can only win economically if those people lose, right? And so I think that's where the nation's struggle is right now. And it's, for me, I think it's going to lead to an awakening of spirit and of compassion, of radical disruptive change and radical disruptive leadership, because radical disruption often accelerates when things get pretty tough, and things are pretty tough right now.
How do you approach these times that really do impact how you approach your programs and policies?
I mean, nothing works like action. And I'm originally a New Yorker. I came to California 20 some odd years ago. And what's happening right now in California is the reason I came here. California is beginning to show the nation what an inclusive, compassionate state and nation state can look like. And our economy's, our economy leaves a lot of people out, but compared to the nation, the California economy is doing okay. This idea of radical compassion, allowing undocumented children to get health coverage, and other kinds of, expanding mental health services. And so I think California is in a position where we just need to act. We need to, there are some things we can do that can further show the way. One campaign that we're involved with is we think we should stop putting young people in prison. We think we should just end juvenile incarceration. California is kind of quietly on that path through the work of great organizations like Homeboy Industries. But let's get not just more compassionate, but let's get smarter with our compassion. Let's invest more in prevention on the front end. Let's make sure our kids in third grade can read. Let's make sure that children who are having defiant issues in the school setting are not suspended out of school. But when a kid acts out in school, the question needs to become, what's going on with you, rather than why are you so bad, right? A kid acting out in school, whether it's 5th grade, 7th grade, or 9th grade, the data tell us and the research tell us that the child has probably been exposed to trauma or adversity, is having some difficulty dealing with it, and we need to wrap our arms around that kid and that kid's family with some services and some mental health supports, and that child's outcome will do better, right? These kids are telling us in the 5th grade, and the 6th grade, and the 7th grade, I'm in trouble right now, and I'm going to jail, right? And so I think California is at the leading edge of that. So you can get on a high horse and yell to the top of your lungs, but nothing beats transformation like actionable leadership.
Why don't we have the kind of leadership more that we are celebrating tonight? And where do you see that leadership being able to come from? And are you hopeful?
Yeah, I think the leadership is there. It just needs to be tapped. It needs to be siphoned.
So you do think it's
and
there?
Actionable. It is there. It is there. I think there's a lot of distrust and anxiety around government and institutions right now. I mean, institutions are. There's just not a lot of trust with our civic institutions these days. And but I think if we can get our young people engaged and voting, which is a very big deal, I think California is going to show the way. I'm pretty confident that we're going to see in the next 3 to 5 to 6 years California is showing the nation what leadership looks like, what inclusion looks like, what justice looks like, what smarter investments look like, what an inclusive, all-in economic development strategy looks like. So call me an optimist. That's what I am.
Do you have more of a sense of mission than you ever have?
Yeah, and I think I probably got more fired up since the election, and I don't mean to say that in a partisan way. The work of justice is, first of all, it's always uphill. Right? If it's hard, it's supposed to be hard, right? The justice curve is it's an uphill gradient. It's not a downhill gradient, right? And so it's supposed to be hard, number one. Number two, how can you not get inspired when a young person who was deemed the dregs of society, who was deemed villainous and evil, turns their life around and now becomes a community leader and a community hero? I mean, I don't know how are you not touched by that when it happens? And so, I go to church on Sunday, but just going to work every day and supporting the work of people like this is just inspiring, and I would not choose any other way to live this life.
So great to have you as our first Radical Disruptor. Thank you, Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Giselle.